Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. Good to have you with us today. It's Wednesday, Paul. I forgot to look and see the 19th of July. I do this, Paul, like 3 or 4 times a week. I still forget to look and see what day it is. Doug Pagitt here in Minneapolis, where it's going to be a glorious, glorious summer day, and really excited, Paul, to have you join us. This is Paul McAllister. Paul does a number of things, but is also the founder and the president of Global Leaders in Unity and Involvement. And Paul, it's good to see you again. We met a few months ago and then had a brief run-in with each other into each other in Washington, D.C. So nice to see you today.
It's good to see you too, Doug. How are you doing?
I am hanging in there, my friend. I am hanging in there. Doing all right. I see Jim is already with us here from California. Jim is up bright and early and is a regular commenter. So good to see you too, Jim. Hey, Paul, we like to start chatting about the weather where we live. It's just one of our little things to remind ourselves that there's a lot of disagreements in this world, but we do live under the same sky. So I told you Minneapolis is a nice, perfectly summer day. How are things in North Carolina?
Well, this morning it was a little bit rainy, and now it looks like the sun is coming out, and it's going to warm up here pretty soon. So I anticipate it will be quite humid and quite uncomfortable for a while.
Yeah. And I'm with you. I was in North Carolina last week outside of Charlotte and at a festival that was mostly outside. And man, when it's hot there, boy, it is just, it captures your attention, I'll say. It is really something.
Are you talking about Wild Goose?
The Wild Goose Festival. Yeah.
Yeah. I wasn't there, but I'm familiar with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hey, any year you can make it, you'd be a great contribution to that gaggle of people at the Wild Goose Festival. For those who don't know, it's a spirituality, art, and justice festival that revolves around Christian spirituality for some people, but also a broader range of what it means to live in the world as people that want to bring about goodness. So, yeah, come join us sometime at that festival. But speaking of all those good things, Paul, the global leaders in unity and involvement, tell us about this because I am fascinated by the title, and the title, global leaders I get, unity I get, but this use of the word evolvement is such an intriguing word. And when we chatted yesterday, before this, to get ready for today, I didn't want to ask you about it because I wanted you to do it live and I wanted to, feel the fullness of the surprise. So why did you pick the word evolvement and what does that get after?
Well, obviously, the word evolvement is associated with the word evolution, which we know is um, um, suggests what we all go through inevitably in life, which is change. And when we think about change and evolution, we think about from the physical, geographical, geospatial context of the movement of the earth and how it spins on its axis and how it even sort of toggles back and forth a little bit. And we're all subject to changes. We were just talking about changes in the weather, for example. And so as we move from place to place, we're subject to different conditions which force us to change.
Hmm.
And we're living in a period of change. If you listen to some of the higher consciousness folks, for example, like Michael Beckwith or even Carlton Pearson, you'll hear them talk about how we're going through a season of change in how we do things in life. And I
Hmm.
believe that I was going through a period of change and evolution as I was leaving pulpit ministry, probably for the last time, even though I'm still a minister. But I don't foresee myself stepping back into the pulpit as a senior minister or senior pastor. And having been an engineer and an Air Force or an Army officer, I was in a place where I was trying to figure out what it is I really, really wanted to do with the balance of my life. And fortunately, I had people in my household, specifically my youngest daughter, Rachel, who suggested to me a name of an organization that included the word evolution or evolvement.
Huh.
Quite honestly, Doug, prior to that, I hadn't thought about the word. I thought it was an old fashioned, archaic term,
Really?
but it was something that she came up
Huh.
with, and I went with it. And it's been working for me ever since. And as I travel the globe and deal with other think tank organizations, people are impressed with the title of the organization.
Yeah, it's really catchy, and I like it. One of the things that it did for me is it reminded me, like when I heard the phrase "global leaders in unity and involvement," my brain was wanting to say the word involvement, right? So
Hmm.
unity and involvement. And sometimes when you just offer a different word as a surprise to people, it's like it's a powerful rhetorical
Mm.
pattern. Um, you've been a pastor, and you've been a pastor inside of churches that have a history of being rather conservative, and oftentimes conservative churches and conservative parts of the rest of our culture don't think highly of evolution, and they partly because they often don't think highly of change. One of the natures of conservatism is to conserve or to preserve or to keep, right? So
Mm.
change in and of itself is always a bit skeptical. But this kind of idea that there's a change that's happening that's not deliberate by a single change maker who's in control, but rather the kind of change that comes over experience and pattern and many choices, some of which are intentional and some of which are unintentional. That has a different kind of thing to it. Um,
Mm.
was that true for you? Was that true that that evolution and those kinds of words in the worlds that you were a pastor in? And tell us a bit about that context of where you've been a pastor. That people look down on the notion of evolution or evolving.
You know, it's interesting. I would say one of my best friends, who was a professor at Howard University in molecular biology and cellular biology, we would often talk about evolution when he was pursuing his PhD. And of course, as a result of his scientific understanding, and he's also a minister, we would get into these very serious discussions about evolution and science and faith. And he became known in my mind as having said, "It's just science, y'all. Uh, it's just science."
That's great.
And so I've never really had to push the issue of evolution in a faith context. It's really not something in my pastorates and in my ministry that has come up quite often, but it has come up in dialogue with others
Hmm,
outside of my own tradition. And
interesting.
fortunately, I've had a good friend like Dr. Eric Walters who's been able to educate me so that when I do speak to the issue of evolution, I
Right,
do have
right.
some sense of understanding about what I'm talking about.
What and what traditions have you been a pastor in?
Principally in the Church of God, headquartered in Anderson, Indiana.
Uh-huh.
That is where I'm ordained. My mother and her mother were Church of God. My maternal grandparents, or great grandparents, were founders of Church of God congregations.
Really? Uh-huh.
And so that's where I'm most rooted. My father was, when he was alive, was Methodist, and so Methodism and the ideals and teachings and theology of the Church of God really are harmonious and synchronized with each other in many ways.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and in terms of Wesleyanism and Wesleyan holiness and Christian perfection,
Yeah.
these are doctrines that have sort of guided and centered my religious thinking for many years as a pastor and even as a child.
Well, I've known a lot of people in Church of God Anderson,
Hmm.
and man, some of those people aren't comfortable with evolution and change at the level that you are. You must have been a bit of an outlier in that world. Did you feel that? Did you feel that way?
Yes, and not just because of that, but I think I bring such a different perspective. First of all, being African American,
Mhm.
um, um, uh, even being a scientist or an engineer, that would be two. Having a strong disposition towards social justice and civil rights and human rights, and then having a vastly different perspective on life because of my global interests. And
Mm.
so I would say the confluence of all of these things definitely tend to place me outside of what I think and what I have experienced to be the general context in which many of our ministries and operations tend to flow. By the way, let me say that does not mean that the church does not have a global mission. It
Mm.
just simply means that as an individual, my thinking has expanded to the point where, in many ways, it falls far beyond those with whom I have associated. And I would say that
Oh,
would be from
interesting.
coast to coast across the church, including race, white and black, and even to some degree gender. But I'm very comfortable in my own skin. I'm very comfortable with who I am, and what I've been able to accomplish up to this stage in my ministry and in my career up to this point. And there are things, and there are many things yet that we still are trying to achieve and aiming to achieve. And one of them, optimistically, idealistically, Doug, would be to help the church foster a different way of thinking and understanding of itself. And
Hmm.
that's part of the reason why, when I left pulpit ministry as a pastor and founded this organization that we're talking about, um, I had that in mind with the name of the organization. If I
Mm.
might say, um, initially, I was thinking of Christian leaders in unity and evolvement.
Hmm.
uh, but I was advised that it might be best to move beyond the spectrum of just Christianity because my worldview was larger than a traditional Christian worldview, and
Hmm.
pursue of the term global. And that is when Christian leaders in unity and evolvement became global leaders in
Mm.
unity and evolvement.
Mm. Which I guess also changes the acronym, from clue to glue, which is
Yeah.
a pretty good one. That's something I find interesting in our conversations. Hearing you when we were in Oxford, England, we were at this colloquium on Christian nationalism.
Hmm.
One of the things that happens in Christianity, and I've spent my adult life working in churches and Christian organizations, and this is one of the things that's always sat a little funny with me, is how church centric and Christianity centric Christian churches can become. Partly because they believe that many people believe that their calling sort of sits at the center of the heart of God. And then it can make it seem as if the point of life, the point of humanity, is somehow connected to churches, right? And to church life. I mean, I go to churches sometimes and they sing songs about wanting God to build the church, over and over, kind of, repetitively asking for this.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that, I don't know, the Christianity that I got into was one that really was trying to say, hey, human beings that want to follow in this way, your calling is to live in the world and in the global context, and not to be an outpost that people
Hmm.
in the world can run to be safe from the globe or safe from the world. And I know people use world and all this stuff in a variety of ways, but that kind of overall perspective, I feel like, is one of the great sorting questions for people, right? Do you feel like the church is the center of life, or do you feel like humanity and the globe is the center of our imagination? Do you think similarly, or have you had different versions of that way of thinking over the years?
I'm going to try to be brief in my response, and I hope, and hopefully, I will be a good panelist for you today, or a good discussant. But I do feel the way that you do feel, Doug, in this regard. Here's the thing: we say, quoting scripture, that God was in Christ reconciling
Hmm.
the world unto Himself.
Wow.
And oftentimes, I think in church and within Christendom, we focus more on God than reconciliation. I think this is one of the reasons why
Wow.
we have problems with race, even though we use the word reconciliation over and over and over
Yeah.
again. We don't understand our humanity, our common interest, and the variance and degrees of difference that exist amongst us. Some of
Interesting.
it is natural, some of it has been created by man. And so God's interest is in restoring
Huh.
harmony and confluence and congregation, if you will. So if church would look at itself as having that mission, I believe it would be able to help
Hmm.
rectify some of the social ills. And that would go beyond just the issue of race, but it would go towards all
Mm.
ills that we
Right.
face and experience
Right.
within society. So yes, I do seem to I do think of things as you do. And let me add this. I think it would also help us understand that the answers to all of our questions are not within one particular nation or
Right.
within, or within one particular ideology, but require
Mm.
um, a broader, extended view of the world, which is
Mm.
part of the reason why I think the Great Commission says, "Go into all the world."
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Go into
Yeah.
all the world. Let me go ahead and quote it so some folks who are listening won't get upset with me. Go into all the world and preach the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but
Yeah.
yet
Make
it's
make
going into
disciples. Yeah.
all the world and connecting with people who have different understandings of how God relates to us, I think is a very crucial aspect of what we're trying to do with Glue. We're just trying to do it from both a faith and a policy perspective at this juncture.
Yeah. Did you always think about things this way, or was there a particular season of life where you felt like, an alarm clock was going off and you were waking up to these ideas?
Ah, what a great question, Doug. Um, I think I have my parents to thank for that. You see, I've got a bunch of books on the shelf back here.
Yeah, you do.
I think I picked up that hobby from my dad as a child. So, but over time, just living, working as an engineer, I remember when I was a graduate student at Clemson University.
Hmm.
I had my first encounter, actually, not my first encounter, because even as an undergrad at South Carolina State University, I had many Indian professors. But at South Carolina State, they were professors, they were not colleagues, they were not peers, they were not classmates. When I went to Clemson, I had many peers and friends and colleagues who came from different parts of the world. And as a result of that, they challenged my thinking. So we were not only trying to work on control theory and electromagnetic theory and solid state device physics and quantum mechanics and all of that kind of stuff, wave theory and so forth. We were actually in our spare time, Doug, having these intense dialogues about what we believed,
Hmm.
which is what I think part of the college experience ought to be. By the way, let me throw something in to this conversation. Because that should be part of the college experience, this is why I'm so much in disfavor of institutions that are ideologically straitjacketed. I think we
Mm.
need to open up discourse in our universities rather than cutting off and shutting down discourse. It doesn't make for good citizens. It doesn't make for good people, and it does not foster the kind of commonality of experience that we need. So that being said, I think one of my good friends named Nazim Singh was very, very helpful in challenging me. And he walked with a limp.
Mm.
There was something wrong with his right leg from birth. But even though he walked with a limp, his mind was astute, his personality was brilliant, and his ideas were, quite frankly, far more advanced and developed than were mine. So I
Mm.
had to learn. And I think
Yeah.
that has continued on throughout the balance of life. Mm.
I've only been a hobbyist around issues of quantum physics and electromagnetism. And back in like 2000, I was a pastor of a church for 20 years. I was a pastor of a church here in Minneapolis, and we'd have a Thursday night quantum physics group, and we would. At
Mm.
the time, we'd order those CDs from or DVDs from the great courses, and we would watch these college lectures on quantum physics, and then have a discussion group about the implication of quantum physics on Christian spirituality, and that, of course, leads to electromagnetism. It leads to just a whole sense of how you could have two different realities based on on size, at the quantum level versus at the non-quantum level. And it was just so unbelievably helpful and mind-opening. And we were just all a bunch of amateurs, reading popular level of stuff. It just makes my heart pitter with a sense of admiration, a little regret that you were actually in real classes, taking real lectures from people and talking about that. And we were having to watch it DVDs and talk about it. But man, I just think that like that perspective, and that's why on Thursdays in this podcast stream we have a conversation with an astrophysicist named Paul Wallace. I don't know if you know Paul Wallace yet, but if not, I'd love to make the introduction. He's outside of Atlanta and teaches at a university there, and is a Christian and an astrophysicist. And anyway, I like that because sometimes our ability to think about larger issues, social structures, and I was a social scientist in college and stuff, so I like social structures and social systems and how we organize and different people and people groups. But also, once you start actually looking at how things are made and what there is in the universe, I mean, that'll pop your eyes open in a hurry. That makes you realize, oh, maybe our problem solution mechanistic way of thinking about the world isn't all there is to offer.
You know, oftentimes when I'm at think tank conferences and we talk about the future of think tanks, one of the issues I brought up is my experience when I was an undergraduate at Fermilab.
Oh, come
And
on, come on! You're at Fermilab. Oh,
I, I, I was at Fermilab for
Paul,
summer.
let me just interrupt and ask: have you ever watched a person develop a crush on you in live action? Because that's happening right now. It's just my admiration is just deepening all that much more. So I'm about to fanboy for the rest of this conversation, but please go on and tell us about your life at Fermi Lab.
Well,
Incredible.
it was interesting to get an opportunity to work there over the summer with some top-notch physicists, and we were just little, undergrads, lowly undergrads. We didn't know anything hardly. Some of us really hadn't even had the academic coursework to
Yeah.
really understand what we were trying to do there. But by the time we left, we understood a great deal. And one of our mentors, our advisors, was a Nobel Prize physicist. And he was the most generous,
Mm.
uh, most kind, and humble human being I think I've ever met. And that told me something as I was entering ministry at that stage, that it is quite possible and practical to
Mm.
be a theorist, a scholar, a deep thinker, and one who posed questions about the universe and its construction and how it was constructed, and still have a high regard for people.
Wow.
Um, and so I learned a great deal from him. Um, you know, I was there as a member of the HBCU community,
Mhm.
but we had students also from the Ivy Leagues, and so you had this interface, I'm sorry, between white kids and black kids, some of whom had never seen people who looked like each other before.
Mhm.
Uh, and so we challenged each other. We had to get to know each other. We had to cross the Rubicon of some of our thinking about whiteness and blackness because we stayed in common spaces. So there was a great deal that we had to learn, but we also found that we had so many common interests beyond issues of race and color and economics,
Mm.
fused with this quest to understand how the Creator created His world and how it came into being and how to sustain it. So these are some of the thoughts that I have when I think about Fermilab and some of the comments that you're making about the
Good
great
golly.
courses. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is awesome. Okay. So you're college, post college. You become an engineer, which we can talk about, and you're also moving back and forth in ministry things. I'm interested in that just personally, like how that went um, for you, and also your experience, because sometimes those two worlds don't understand one another, and people can sometimes feel like I have no idea what you're doing over there. There's the thing you need or the thing we offer is found here, not over in that other world. Can you just talk a bit about that? How that went for you and those decisions you were making and how you, because we talked yesterday and you've basically told me that you throughout your life you've merged or you've moved back and forth between more of your vocational time being spent leading churches and organizations, and then some of it working for Honeywell and and being a functional working engineer, and then code switching back over into the ministry world and moving back and forth. So I'm just interested in all of that process for you at your younger years and then through your life.
Wow, what a question. Um, I did doctoral work, both at Clemson and later at the University of South Carolina, and even beyond that in theology and social science. And so I'm very comfortable with answering this question because my experience has probably been vastly different from many people with whom I associate in isolated arenas such as religion or faith, or just in science, or just in social science. And I recognize that I'm a kind of I guess you would say a Machiavellian creature of sorts. It
Nice.
doesn't mean I'm Machiavelli. It doesn't mean I have his brilliance or anybody else's brilliance in those other arenas. But what I do is I look at the totality of things. And this is where my creative genius, if you will, coming from the engineering side of things, is manifests itself. Engineers build
Hmm.
and we improve. We look at the world around us um, objectively,
Hmm.
and then we take into consideration the needs of the people around us. And some of these things can be abstract, um, but when you try to reconcile, and this is where the theology comes into place for me, harmonize, reconcile, bringing things together, recognizing that we worship a God who is interested in bringing life together. Yeah, that probably has put me in situations where I've thought a little differently, articulated things a little differently, preached a little differently, taught a little differently, always perhaps looking for some new nugget when
Nice.
persons around me may have been looking for something more steady and more traditional. And that's been problematic. And so, how I've tried to deal with that, um, especially in recent years, is to practice a greater degree of humility um, on a personal level in terms of my relationships with persons. So at
Hmm.
least they can feel comfortable with the person, even if the ideas might seem to be over the top a little bit. I find that if people are comfortable with us, as individuals, then that opens the door for them to pose questions and acknowledge where they don't know or where they need to learn or where we might be able to help each other learn based upon the life experiences that we've had. At the end of the day, it is about life experience. My
Yeah.
mother,
Yeah.
let me say this, my mother
Please. Yeah.
is not an engineer. She's not a scientist. She's my mom. Um, and I always tell people I was in Anson County talking to some political individuals there, and I was quoting my mother and saying, Mama's always right. So at the end of the day, it doesn't take a science degree or an engineering degree or a physics degree. Some things just accrue over the course of living and walking on the planet. And when we have folks in our lives, as I'm sure you do and I do, who can speak to us about life,
Yeah.
then I think it puts some guardrails on some of the eccentricity that
Hmm.
we might explore and help to bring us back to earth, so people can recognize what we're really all about, um, and have respect for those things that we're trying to do. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh
It's
yeah,
a
it's
kind of
great.
long-winded, meandering way of getting there, but I hope it answers your question.
Well, I love nothing more than a long meander of ideas. It's where the gems are normally found. It's like going on a long walk, and that's where you start to find this truth. And I love this idea because fundamentally, human beings need for their experience to be human, right?
Yeah,
Like we can study all the other things, and we should, and it gives us great insight into what we mean. But if that's not in service of how we can extend human flourishing, where
Mhm.
more people are flourishing on this planet in the experiences that it means to be human, then we as
Mhm.
human beings are missing out on one of our great calls. The
Mhm.
the animals and the plants and the rest of the cosmos has its own thing it's going to be up to, right? That's unique. And human beings have our own thing we have to be up to. And the human flourishing is such a crucial piece of all this. All right, I could talk and will sometime talk to you for hours about your background and what you've done, how you've done it. Um, but I also want to pivot a little bit in this work you do because when we met, it was, as I mentioned earlier, in Oxford, England, at this week long event, this colloquium on Christian nationalism, and you're on the board or on the part of the leadership of a group called the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, which is now part of Hebrew College, by the way. So really great. Um, and we're going to be doing a whole podcast interview with Rob and with Or Rose at Hebrew College about all that. So super nerdy stuff for people that don't know yet what we're talking about. But you work with this group called the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, which is how you ended up at this event. I think that's that was your connection. Why was that meeting in Oxford, where it was a colloquium of leaders from the United States interacting with others at Oxford, talking about the threat of white Christian nationalism in America? What got you into that meeting of all the things that you also do?
Well, I think the idea to actually host the event at Oxford came from Rob Schink's good friend Van Guyton, who served as the chancellor for the colloquium that we had there. So I think somewhere between a conversation with Van and
Mm,
Rob, I think Van probably challenged Rob. We need to do this. And
mm,
of course, when you can speak on such friendly terms because you know each other, I think that makes a huge difference. So I believe that's part of the reason why it was held at Oxford. Number two, Rob had been a speaker at Oxford.
mm,
So he's no stranger to Oxford. He'd been there before. There was a conference held the following week after our colloquium ended that I attended with other scholars from Europe about post Christianity um, and how we understand theological values
mm.
across the church. That gave me some insight into Rob's experience with Oxford. Now, I would say the main question would be not just why Oxford. Obviously, it is a place of stimulation, high rectitude, high value, and all of that. Um, I think he just wanted to hold the event in a place where it would stimulate deep thinking
Yeah, yeah,
and
sure.
questioning, which is what Oxford is known for. And I'm wearing a shirt right now that's got Oxford. I have an Oxford logo on it. This belongs to one of my sons, by the way. It's not
Uh-huh.
something I purchased when I was there. I would say the topic, Christian nationalism, is one that takes us back to Europe at the end of the
Mm,
day, um, and holding a conversation about white supremacy and whiteness in the center of a venue where so many of the ideas that were espoused at during the 17th century about whiteness and going back before that would have been a part of the rationale as well.
mhm,
Uh,
mhm,
I, for one, feel that being at Oxford was not just an opportunity, but it was mainly a challenge to
mm,
to to bring something back to American shores that is routinely discussed, but not necessarily commonly understood,
mm,
and that is um our origins do not all derive from Eurocentric thinking and ideas. Our culture does
mm,
not derive solely from Eurocentric understandings of life.
mm.
And so there was a lot of that kind of discussion that I was anticipating, and some of that actually did happen. And by the way, even when we were there, we had an opportunity to have dialogue with my good friend Stephen Sizer, who
Yeah, yeah.
lives in the UK. And of course, he is an expert in issues related to Israel and Palestine from a theological perspective. So we brought him into the discussion to help enlarge the conversation about bias in theology and race, and try to dig at the underpinnings of white supremacy and white nationalism as it is being expressed, not just in Europe and here in the United States, but in other venues around the world.
And I think there's a YouTube video of you in conversation with Stephen. Is that right? Did you shoot a video with him? And I think I saw
We
that
did.
the other
We
day.
did.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah.
another excellent piece. We talk a lot about Christian nationalism here. We do whole trainings on it. We've got a whole separate podcast, and we have curriculum. I've learned a lot about Christian nationalism, and one of the things is that it doesn't have a single definition, and that's helpful, right? Because it's not one thing; it's a perspective. It's a worldview. When you think about and talk about Christian nationalism, and someone says, "Oh, you're going to Oxford, and this thing is about the threat of white Christian nationalism," and they say, I mean, I'm not for Christian nationalism or anything because nobody is, right? And they're like, but I don't really know what it is. How do you describe the what is Christian nationalism question?
Christian nationalism is not just a worldview, but it is a way of approaching people, and and it is not just loyalty to one's country and having an affinity for the uplift of Christianity as a dominant religion within it. It's more than that. It's also the past and seeking to revive a history and a legacy that was created from a Christianized concept. So I would say, in lay terms, that Christian nationalism is a belief that government should be controlled auspiciously by those who come from the Christian context, that others should bow and acknowledge and be grateful for the presence of Christians, um, irrespective as to what their views might be and how they live. It's an ideology of supremacy,
Hmm.
a belief that a nation cannot hold together unless it is Christian,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and that apart from the presence of Christians and the adoption or the misadoption of the "ye are the salt of the earth" viewpoint from the Bible, that unless that is the case, that people and nations and civilization is doomed.
yeah.
Which of course it is not.
Yeah, well, that is a great point because for a lot of Christian nationalists, their issue is not just the United States. They're not only trying to make the United States of America a Christian nation. There's a belief that this should be exported to all of the world. There's also a global vision for Christian nationalists. Like that's one of the realities that people run into is that for some people it is very, you know, uh, United States centric,
That's right.
but not for the deep thinkers, the ones that are pushing this stuff, the real ideology behind it. They want to take over every nation in the world with a Christian agenda. Like they're up for Christianizing the whole kit and caboodle. And
Hmm.
that's the point, is that they want to not only extend, and they think the United States plays a unique role in that, and is the United States and Israel are the two nations that are sort of the exemplars for what should be happening around the rest of the world. So we have to get things right at home. We have to protect Israel and then export this all over the world. So for some people, when they run into Christian nationalism, they hear people talking about like just fighting about school boards or prayer in school or chaplains in, on a football team or football prayer. So it can feel like it's very small and that people are trying to keep others out. And that is true. There's a whole lot of Christians that want to just make sure that, or a lot of Christian nationalists rather, want to make sure that not everybody's equally participating. But that really sits inside of a larger global vision that is competing with other global visions.
That's
Uh,
right.
and and I don't. Anyway, I find that kind of interesting, right? That um, it's to some people it's the making the world smaller, and for others it's how do we expand this Christian view of the world to take over the entire world.
Mhm. That's I do a lot of work in the interfaith arena at this stage. Sometimes I wonder how I got here. Have you ever been in places and spaces and you said, "How did I get here? What brought me here?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah." And so I find myself um, um, serving in several capacities that are interfaith that I would have never suspected would happen, but I'm so glad that they have. And I'm speaking specifically of the National Council of Churches and the Interfaith Relations Convening Table, where I serve on the Theology Task Force with other scholars, as well as serving as chair of the Interfaith Caucus of the North Carolina um, Democratic Party. And so it's hard for me to accept that other faith traditions, other people from different cultures around the world, um, should be constrained by white Christian thinking and
Hmm.
understanding. Um, uh, it's interesting. Um, we talked about earlier some of my childhood and upbringing. I remember more than maybe 20 years ago, I was in an airport. I think I was going to a conference or traveling on business for one of the companies I used to work for, and I bumped into a Catholic priest. And so here I am, a young minister, talking to a Catholic priest in an airport. He doesn't know me, I don't know him. But Doug, I tell you the truth, I had such an affinity for him as an individual because his thinking and his conversation reflected something that went beyond my holiness perfectionist, white Christianized worldview. That once again, um, I learned the importance of appreciating the differences that we have
Mm.
and valuing those differences. And I guess I simply want to say I wish more people in this country, number one, if they're Christian, would live in accordance with those values that Christians espouse. That's number one, and the core principle is love, love of oneself and love of neighbor, and then springboarding from those two fundamental teachings of Christ. Well, we don't see enough of that
Mm.
in the world. But I think if we would see more of that, if we could foster and generate more of that through the kinds of dialogue that I'm talking about, which are interfaith, interreligious, cross-cultural, so forth and so on, then I think maybe folk might be persuaded that a Christian worldview is the answer.
Yeah.
Um, but to just impress um, those ways of thinking about life upon people and saying everybody in the country has to think and feel in the same way. Well, that's foolish.
Yeah.
It's obscene. And quite frankly, it's obscene. And if I look at my own history as an African American with deep roots in the South and understand where our problems originated as African American people, I have to reject that out of hand, no matter who espouses it, no matter where it comes from, because my history is tied up with the people who I know best, and the
Yeah.
people who nurtured and taught me best look like me. And
Mm.
so I have to affirm them in
Right on.
those things that I pursue. And that
Right.
means appreciating the differences that we have, valuing the learning experiences that can come from each other, and not allowing any ideology, and certainly not white supremacy, white nationalism, to be the dominant motive or motif in the world. I will crush it if I had a hammer. There was a song that we used to sing, right, years and years ago.
You'd hammer in
I
the
could
morning?
be a Paul Mary. Yeah, if I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning and hammer in the evening and hammer all over this land. Well, we got to hammer out that type of
Yeah.
thinking because it's hateful,
Yeah.
and it deprives people of their full humanity.
Yeah. I remember
Herman,
in my early days of Christianity, I wasn't raised in Christian life or church, had no experience at all and got into it when I was 16, 17 years old. And one of the first groups of people that I was around were people that did interfaith work around the world. And then I realized there were like two different approaches to interfaith work. Those who were engaging in interfaith work in order to convert those that they were in conversation with. They'd work in Indonesia, they would work in China, they would work in then, at the time, the Soviet Union. And the purpose of that was evangelism, right? And then there were others who the purpose of their interfaith life was to learn and to grow themselves and to take the truths that they find in other cultures and other religious traditions to expand the understanding of Christianity. And I really started to like that second group more than the first group for all kinds
Yeah.
of reasons. And I remember somebody in just post college, I think, from that second group that said, "Hey, look, our point is to engage with the rest of the world because even if you get Christianity as right as humanly possible, there's still missing elements.
Mm,
God still has truths for all of us that have to be found in the other places." And they start quoting passage, Jesus saying things like, there are children of other, or we have sheep of other pastures. And when you
right.
go into the world and you make disciples, it's not to convert them, but it's to engage with them. And what does it mean to be disciples? The disciple making act is a co-creative act as you travel into the world. Like just a different view than the convert them. It was, there are things we all need. And the more we can exchange, and so I'm just wondering if that hits with you, because I'm hearing you describe like, well, people are telling you that the world is, you have science or faith or all these, and you're like, well, I think they all have. I think they're all part of the, I realize that as a theological category, I want to be an all list. Like I want all of it. I just think my theology needs to be based on allism, right?
Yeah.
That all the ideas and all the people and all the cultures, that's what's the fabric of this. Um,
Yeah.
so anyway, I'm just interested in your thoughts on all that.
As you were talking, I thought, yes, and people used to say the world is flat until we learn better. And so when we learn better, we do better. And, you know, many persons who I know read Howard Thurman. I read Howard Thurman. You may have read Howard
Oh
Thurman.
yeah.
And of course, his seminal book, he wrote many books, but the one that most people are familiar with, Jesus and the Disinherited, he talks about his conversation in India, where he has this conversation surrounding the supremacy of Christ and the supremacy specifically of Christianity in the world. Um, I want to say this. I think in the way that a Howard Thurman might think. I'm no Howard Thurman. Okay, so let me sort of retract the way I expressed that. Okay, um, I believe that how he thought about the world was precisely how we should think about the world. As you've said, in the co creative aspect of life
Mm.
with other religions. Now, this might sound like heresy. This will sound like heresy to some people who are listening to this conversation, particularly those who believe in, I believe it's John 14:16. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. I was taught that, but everyone was not taught that. Why was I taught that? I was taught that because my parents taught me that, and their parents taught them that, and their parents taught them that. But what about the guy who lives in India? Okay, what about the person who lives in different places in the world? Does God not have a plan for them too? And some would say, well, our mission is to go into all the world and make sure they understand.
Yeah.
But understand what? What is it that we want them to understand? Why is it that we cannot also learn to understand? Why is it that we have to
Yes.
embolden ourselves to promulgate our way of thinking and understanding upon other cultures, as if to say they have no insight, no understanding, no revelation from God at all?
Yeah.
And this is why I bring up Howard Thurman, because I think he tried to bring people together from across these many different cultures and different experiences to uplift something that is far more beautiful. And that reminds me of something. When we lived in Minnesota, my family and I, when our children were small, I attended a concert in Minneapolis, and it was a concert of a mixed group of singers from different races and churches. And as much as I love to hear black gospel at the church we were attending at the time, I discovered as a musician and from a family of musicians,
Mm,
uh, there's something far more beautiful when people get together and they sing from the experiences and that are shared cross culturally. So when you're
mhm,
singing some Indian music and you're singing some Japanese theme songs and you're singing some African American songs, and then you're bringing all of that together, that's the picture of heaven that I want to see on earth,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And that's what I define um, as expressing truth
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
in ministry and in all that we do. And so that's my aspiration at this juncture. I don't mind hearing those who want to talk about Jesus. That's fine. I'm a Christian. I understand that, but I'm not just a Christian. I'm a
Mhm. Yeah.
human being
Yeah,
who
there it
has
is. Yep.
others.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that and man, that is you know, there's a big arguments inside of Christianity arguing about the the nature of Jesus, the divine and human nature of Jesus, and there's a lot of reasons why we end up in this bizarre conversation.
yeah,
Um, but there's moments where you think, I think we need to have that conversation about ourselves. Like, hey, remember, you're a human being, right? Like that's the first most fundamental thing. The beliefs, the traditions, the ways, that is something else. And I actually just have a view of that whole John 10:10 thing, way, truth, and the life. That is like, I think
yeah.
Jesus is saying,
Thank you.
Everybody gets there. I mean, if you end up there, you've just gotten there in the same old way that human beings do it, the same way I got there. I think that's what Jesus. Anyway, that's how I choose to interpret the "I am the way, the truth, no one gets there except through me" is like through the same way that I got there. This is just how human beings do it, right? Like, I think it's a commonality narrative that Jesus was introducing as opposed to a separating narrative. But that's some of the fun that we get to do with ancient statements and texts and words is we get to play with them, we get to interpret them. But what we do know is we live in a really complex world that also feels a lot like itself. Like when you go places and you travel and you're with people from radically different perspectives,
Mhm,
y- y- uh, and we live in such a divided country for all kinds of reasons and such a divided world for all kinds of reasons. And yet that all defies the actual lived experience that we have, right? Which is there's always something good to know and to learn. No tradition, no faith, no period of time can know all the important things. I feel like we've lost some things in our current day that we might not even know that were there. And I don't know, 50 and 100 and 300 and 1,000 years from now, there's going to be truths that people are embracing and felt like they've known their whole life that we have no clue of, just whole realities. Like we're sitting here having this conversation about quantum physics and
mhm.
electromagnetism and the Fermi lab. And
Absolutely.
your
Yes.
grandpa didn't have any of those conversations, right? He didn't know anything about any of that stuff when he was a kid. He wasn't in that because that's just how it is. I don't know. And there's such a scarcity model and such a limitation model and such a heroes, villains, and victims model that I don't know. It just feels like when I talk to people like you and meet people like you, and that's why when we met at Oxford and it was a very odd kind of meeting of how we could be with each other and meet and because these events like that are just that way the things you said in private conversations, just a couple of the things you said in your presentation, I'm like, all right, that guy, he is on to something. You know what I mean? There's just a way that you sort of hear it. And it's not even a lot of what someone says where you go, I think they're tapping into that same sort of vein of life. And so I just so appreciate you being willing to be with us here in this situation and talk today and tell people about global leaders and unity and involvement. Um, anything people should know about getting involved with you or following along in what you do and keeping up on all of this?
Well, we have interns from different countries and some here in the country as well. We have interns who are from Ukraine. I've traveled to Ukraine quite a bit over the last 8 to 10 months.
Wow.
Um, and it was specifically to be in solidarity with not just them, but even others whom I've met in different venues in my travels with global leaders in unity and involvement. We're in the process of looking to create a journal for young scholars
Mm,
who want to publish their works and may find it a little challenging to get into some of the more traditional and prestigious publications, but they have something to say. And so we're trying to create a venue and a forum for them. If anyone wants to be involved with working with young scholars, such as those whom I mentor, some are in the legal profession, some are in
Oh,
economics, some
hmm,
are in the sciences. We welcome all comers. I would also say this. GLUE was fortunate to be able to work with some young scholars to present a policy brief to the Think 7, which is the Think engagement arm of the G7. And fortunately, that policy brief was accepted and received by the G7. And it dealt with some of the things that we're talking about, but from a human rights perspective.
great.
So I would simply say for those who want to support GLUE, you can go to our website, which is glueinstitute.org. You can certainly contact me. I'm always looking for people to help out and help build the organization. We're still small, but I
Mhm.
think we've done a great deal over the last few years that we're very, very proud of. And we just want to continue to expand our reach and influence. We have an opportunity often to speak at conferences, not just serve on panels, but actually present our policies and ideas. And so we're looking to continue to do much, much more of that. And finally, I will say this as a way of inspiring those who have aspiration. I would say think big because GLUE was nowhere on my radar. And as I've told you, when I started GLUE, when the idea first was given to me and planted in my membranes, um, I was a little bit afraid of it. I thought it was
Mhm.
something that was beyond my capacity to do. And lo and behold, I found myself sitting in think tank arenas
Hmm.
with CEOs and executives from major think tank organizations across the world. And I realized that all of my experiences that we've talked about, from being at Fermilab and being with Honeywell Labs and being with
Mhm.
other venues, all of that prepared me to sit in the room with other executives and promote the ideas that we're talking about today.
Hmm.
And so I would encourage people to not be afraid of the process of becoming and
Hmm.
learning and journeying. It's taking you to some place that you may not know,
I love
but
it.
it's also taking you to a place that opens doors for others. And this is really the main purpose for Blue, is to pave a path for future generations of leaders who can take us to places of evolution and change
Hmm.
that maybe we can't quite see because we're locked into certain ways of certain patterns of being and existing in the world. And that may be fine for us, but it won't work for them.
Yeah,
So
very
we have to
great.
do something that enlarges the and expands the reach of our younger generations to help them be prepared for the future. That's
Great.
what Glue is all about. So if you want to support us, please contact me. We'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. And as on point of a climactic finish that should be. I don't want to let you go without asking, what do
Yeah.
you know about being in Ukraine that we should know as people who don't have the experience that you have? Is there something that's pretty evident to you that you wish more people would know and understand about Ukraine's situation?
Several things. I know that many of us would love to see the war come to an end. I want to see the war come to an end. But when we talk about violence and aggression, when someone punches you in the mouth and is threatening you, then you really have no choice but to fight or flee. And the Ukrainian people have no choice but to fight. So we're helping them fight in order to end the
Yeah.
conflict. Um, I'm so proud of my colleagues and friends there. Maria Limberg, who helped me with the policy paper, and her family with whom I've stayed. Oksana, I could go on and on and on and on. Radonna, Kate, friends that I have. They are proud people. They are proud people. We should not use Ukrainians as a proxy for
Mm.
our own benefit in Western civilization. They are
Wow.
people of dignity and worth in their own right, and we should respect that, support that. Yes, we need to end this war, and I think we need to end it decisively, but we need to end it in a way that is promoting what we're learning from the Ukrainian people, the spirit of survival, of thriving in spite of.
Mm.
We're learning something from them. They're not just feeding us because they're the world's breadbasket. They're nurturing us in what it means to evolve and shape human destiny because they
Mm.
refuse to yield and
Yeah.
they come together as a people. The final thing I would say about Ukraine is they respect their leaders, but they understand the value of coming together as citizens.
Mm.
So what matters most is citizenship and
Wow.
unity of the people, as opposed to uplifting a demagogue like some in this country are doing with
Yeah.
Mr. Trump
That's right. Hmm.
or some other figure of
Hmm.
history. What's most important about Ukraine is that um, when I was there in Kiev, I really did not want to leave. I found it to be
Mm.
such a beautiful place, not just physically and aesthetically, but the people. And that's something I would appreciate others knowing about Ukraine
Wow.
as well. There is a deep sense of loyalty to what is good, what is right, what is just, and what is fair in Ukraine. It's always been that way, and it
Wow.
continues to survive to this very day. That's why I believe God has allowed us to be centered on Ukraine because it
Mm.
models what we need to see in people, in humanity, and in country, and in loyalty and affinity
Wow.
in all other parts of the world. So I'll stop there. I could say a lot more about Ukraine, but that's
Well,
enough.
thank you for sharing. It means a lot. Yeah. And Paul, this has been such a great conversation. I look forward to more and staying in touch and doing many things together in the future with you and Vote Common Good and the global leaders and Unity and Involvement.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, my friend.